I still remember the crunch of gravel under my tires that morning. The sky was heavy, bruised with storm clouds, and the air smelled of rain waiting to fall. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned pale. I told myself I wasn't nervous, but I was lying. I had rehearsed what I would say to my uncle 100 times in my head, but now, parked at the old boundary fence, every word felt too small for the weight it carried. This wasn't just about land. It was about history, about loyalty, about truth. When I stepped out of the car, my boots sank into the soft earth. For a moment, I let my fingers graze the weathered wooden post at the edge of the property. I had stood here so many times as a child, my feet dangling from the fence while Grandpa told me stories about this land. One day, he'd say, "This will be yours to protect." But somewhere between then and now, something changed. I didn't understand how, or why, but the whispers had started months ago. That the deed wasn't what I thought it was. That pieces of land had shifted hands quietly. That my uncle, the man who taught me how to fish in the creek at the back of the property, might not have been honest with me, or anyone. I spotted him near the barn, leaning against a fence post, cigarette in hand. The smoke curled lazily in the damp morning air. When he saw me, he smiled. But it was the kind of smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Didn't expect you out here today," he said. "I figured it was time," I replied, holding up the folder under my arm. "We need to talk." He nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this moment all along. Inside the barn, dust motes danced in thin streams of sunlight, cutting through the wooden slats. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp hay, a reminder of summers long gone. I laid the folder on a workbench, opening it to reveal copies of the deed and maps passed down through generations. "Why does this boundary line change here?" I asked, tracing the pen along a shaded section. "Grandpa's map shows this ridge is still ours, but the current deed says otherwise." He chuckled softly, a sound too casual to be genuine. "Clerical hiccups," he said, waving his hand. "You know how the county is with paperwork." But his jaw tightened when I pressed further. "And the signatures? Grandpa's and yours. They're dated the same day, but the ink is different." The barn went silent, except for the distant caw of a crow perched on the roof. That's when I noticed it. The key around his neck, glinting faintly under the light. He caught me staring and tucked it beneath his shirt without a word. Something twisted in my stomach. That key. What was he hiding? I took a step closer. "Uncle, I need to know what really happened here. To the land, to Grandpa's will, to Elena." At her name, his eyes flickered. A flash, gone as quickly as it came, but enough to chill me. My aunt had disappeared years ago, leaving behind nothing but silence. And suddenly, I wondered if this land held more than just roots and soil. I wanted answers. But deep down, I already knew. Asking questions here might cost me more than I was ready to lose. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I'm sharing here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. Because this isn't just about land anymore. It's about everything we thought we knew. And what we're about to find out. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and old wood when we sat down across from each other. My uncle's hands rested casually on the table, but his shoulders were stiff, as if bracing for something he didn't want to face. Between us lay a stack of papers, maps, deeds, and signatures, older than both of us combined. I slid the folder toward him. "Explain this," I said softly. My voice trembled despite my effort to stay calm. He flipped through the papers with deliberate slowness, his thumb pausing on the section that had brought me here, the shift in the boundary line. He didn't look surprised, not even a little. "Like I told you," he said, leaning back. "Clerical hiccups. The county makes mistakes." I shook my head. "This isn't a mistake. Grandpa's original deed and the county's record don't match. And this," I tapped my finger on a date, "this amendment, you signed it." His gaze met mine, steady, unreadable. "Because Grandpa asked me to." A flash of heat rose to my cheeks. "That's impossible." Grandpa would have told me. He promised me the ridge was mine. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Pity, maybe. Or guilt. You were young, he said finally. Some things aren't meant for children to know. That word, children, cut deeper than he intended. I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't here to play on the fence or skip rocks in the creek. I was here for answers. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Then tell me now. All of it. The silence between us stretched long enough for the ticking clock above the stove to sound like a drumbeat. Finally, he sighed, reached into his shirt pocket, and pulled out a brass key, the same one I'd seen in the barn. He set it on the table between us. This is what you're really after, he said quietly. I stared at the key. What does it open? He hesitated. The drawer, he said, nodding toward the old oak cabinet by the wall, where I keep the originals. I stood, heart pounding, and crossed the room. The drawer slid open with a groan, revealing a leather-bound folder sealed with a faded red ribbon. Inside were the original deeds, and something else. A single envelope, brittle and yellowed with age. It was addressed to my mother, in Grandpa's handwriting. My uncle's voice broke the silence. Don't read that. But of course I did. Inside was a short note. If you're reading this, it means the storm has passed. Protect the ridge. Don't trust anyone, not even family. Some things can't be undone. My breath caught in my throat. What storm? I whispered. My uncle's jaw tightened. You don't want those answers. I looked up sharply. Don't I deserve to know? His hand came down on the table with a heavy thud, rattling the coffee mugs. Some things are buried for a reason, he said, voice low, steady, final. I stared at him, searching his face for a sign. Guilt, anger, regret. But there was nothing, only walls. That's when I noticed the second folder, hidden beneath the deeds, marked with 3 simple letters in black ink, ELA. I reached for it, but he snatched it away before I could touch it. You're not ready for that, he said. Something inside me snapped. Then make me ready. He didn't answer. He just stood, walked to the window, and lit another cigarette, his back to me. The smoke curled toward the ceiling like a warning. I sat frozen, the note still in my hand, my pulse thundering in my ears. Whatever ELA meant, whatever storm Grandpa feared, it wasn't in the papers. It was in the silence my uncle was guarding, and I knew I wouldn't leave without breaking it. I didn't sleep that night. The envelope lay on my bedside table, Grandpa's words looping endlessly in my head. Protect the ridge. Don't trust anyone, not even family, by sunrise. My chest felt tight with questions. What storm was he talking about? And why would he warn my mother not to trust her own brother, my uncle? I needed answers, but I knew better than to go back to him. So I went somewhere he never would have expected. Grandma's house still smelled like cinnamon and lavender, even though she'd been gone nearly 10 years. The curtains were drawn, the air heavy with dust and memories. I stepped softly across the creaking floorboards, my fingers grazing the chipped edges of old photo frames. I didn't know what I was looking for, I just knew I had to look. In the kitchen, I opened every drawer, every tin, every jar of buttons and faded postcards. Nothing. Then I saw it. A chipped wooden recipe box on the highest shelf, tucked behind an old tin of loose tea. It was heavier than I expected. Inside were dozens of neatly folded index cards, each with Grandma's handwriting, pies, preserves, soups, and then, near the bottom, a thin envelope marked simply with 3 letters. ELA. My breath caught. The same letters I'd seen on the hidden folder in my uncle's drawer. I hesitated before sliding the paper out. Inside wasn't a letter, but an old hand-drawn map on yellowing parchment. The edges were curled and faint tea stains dotted the paper. It was the land, our land. But something was wrong. On this map, the boundary stretched far beyond the ridge my uncle claimed wasn't ours. A large shaded area, the very part now in his name, was clearly marked Whitmore property. I felt the air leave my lungs. Grandpa hadn't been mistaken. We'd been lied to. The map trembled slightly in my hands as footsteps echoed down the hallway. I spun around, heart hammering, only to see my mother standing in the doorway, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than I'd expected. I held up the map. "Did you know about this?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She leaned against the doorframe, fingers clutching the wood like it was the only thing holding her up. Finally, she whispered, "You shouldn't have found that." "Why not?" My voice cracked. "Mom, Grandpa wanted us to protect this land. He warned you not to trust Uncle, didn't he?" She flinched. A tiny, involuntary movement, but enough to confirm what I already feared. "Listen to me," she said finally, stepping closer. "Some truths don't make anything better. They only destroy what's left." Her hands shook as she reached for the map, but I pulled it back instinctively. "What happened here, Mom? What's ELA? And why does Uncle act like he owns everything?" For a long time, she said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't catch it, she murmured, "Because he does." I froze. "What are you talking about?" Tears welled in her eyes. She sank into the kitchen chair and buried her face in her hands. "I asked him to handle things when your father died. We were drowning in debt. I thought I was saving us." I stared at her, disbelief hardening into something heavier. "You gave him the land?" "It wasn't supposed to be permanent," she whispered. "Just temporary." But things got complicated. After the storm, she stopped herself, lips pressed tight. There it was again. The storm. "What storm, Mom?" She shook her head violently, wiping her tears with trembling fingers. I can't do this. Just leave it alone." I slipped the map back into its envelope and walked toward the door, her voice following me in a broken whisper. "You don't understand what you're digging into. Some things are better buried, but it was too late for that, because as I stepped onto the porch, I saw someone across the street leaning against a lamppost, watching me. It was Mr. Cole, the old farmhand who'd worked for Grandpa decades ago. When our eyes met, he nodded once, like he'd been waiting for me. Mr. Cole's silhouette was framed against the fading light, his old work jacket buttoned up tight, despite the warm evening air. He tipped his cap when I stepped onto the porch, his hand trembling slightly. "Been waiting on you," he said, voice rough as gravel. I frowned. "For me?" He nodded once, glancing over his shoulder, as if to make sure no one was listening. "I heard you've been asking questions about the ridge." "About your uncle. Thought maybe it's time you know some things." I hesitated, gripping the envelope in my hand. "You worked here for decades, Mr. Cole. If you know something, just tell me." He motioned toward the old bench swing on Grandma's porch. "Best we sit." The chains creaked under his weight as he lowered himself slowly, his knees stiff from years of labor. I sat beside him, heart pounding loud enough I was sure he could hear it. He stared out at the fields, the fading sunlight stretching long shadows across the grass. "It was the night of the storm," he began, his voice distant, almost hollow. "Must have been 25 years ago now. Rain came down like the sky was breaking open. I was in the barn, mending a fence post, when I heard shoutin'." I leaned forward. "Shouting? From who?" He rubbed his calloused hands together, eyes fixed on the ground. "Your grandpa and your uncle. It was bad. Never heard 'em fight like that. Sounded dangerous." My chest tightened. "Dangerous how?" Mr. Cole hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might get up and leave. Instead, he sighed, his breath shaky. "Your Aunt Elena came running out of the house, screaming something I couldn't make out. Then there was a slam, like the back door busting open, and I saw your uncle driving off in his truck. Fast. Too fast. Considering the storm, I swallowed hard, my throat dry. And Grandpa?" He finally looked at me, his pale blue eyes clouded with something I couldn't name. "Next morning, I found him sitting on that porch, staring out at the fields like a ghost. Wouldn't talk to nobody. Not me, not your grandma, not even Elna," I frowned. "What about her?" "Aunt Elena?" His jaw worked, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a worn thermos from his jacket pocket and twisted the cap, taking a slow sip before speaking again. She packed a bag that morning. Told your grandma she was leaving for the city and, well, that's the last time I seen her. But she never contacted anyone? I asked, my voice rising. Not even a letter? Mr. Cole shook his head slowly. No letters, no calls, nothing. Like she just disappeared. A cold weight settled in my chest. You think Uncle had something to do with it? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the ridge, his lined face hard as stone. That land, it ain't just dirt and trees, you know. There's blood in it. More than you realize. I stared at him, my fingers tightening around the envelope in my lap. What does that mean? He stood suddenly, gripping the porch railing for balance. His voice dropped to a near whisper, shaky but sharp. It means, he said, leaning close, if you're gonna keep digging, you best be ready to find bones. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft creak of the bench swing swaying in the breeze. Then he straightened, pulled his cap low, and started down the path without another word. I called after him. Mr. Cole, what happened that night? What did they fight about? He paused at the end of the walkway, turned halfway, and said just one thing. Ask your uncle about the ledger. Then he disappeared into the fading light, leaving me alone on the porch, with nothing but Grandpa's warning echoing in my head. Protect the ridge. Don't trust anyone. Not even family. I couldn't shake Mr. Cole's words. Ask your uncle about the ledger. The way he'd said it, like the very word carried weight, like it wasn't just numbers on a page, but something rotten buried deep beneath polite smiles and Sunday dinners. That night, I waited until the house was quiet. The cicadas screamed outside, and every creak in the floor sounded louder than thunder. My uncle was asleep upstairs. I knew because the old farmhouse groaned whenever his bedroom door opened. And tonight, it stayed silent. I crept into his office, a small, dim room at the back of the house, lined with dusty bookshelves and locked cabinets. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper. I started with the desk drawers, rifling through bills, insurance forms, and faded photographs of family picnics. But it wasn't until I checked the bottom filing cabinet that I found it. A worn, leather-bound ledger, tucked beneath a stack of outdated tax returns. It looked ancient, its cover soft and cracked from years of use. My fingers tingled as I opened it. Inside were rows of names, dates, and numbers. Payments carefully recorded in my uncle's tight, angular handwriting. Sheriff's offices, county clerks, surveyors. Even the local attorney's name popped up again and again. But these weren't normal transactions. The amounts were too large, too frequent, too strategic. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. 3 payments, all from the same week 25 years ago. The week of the storm Mr. Cole had described. One to the sheriff, one to the county registrar. One marked only with 3 letters in red ink. E-L-A. There it was again. I flipped through more pages, my hands sweating as I uncovered more payments tied to land transfers and document adjustments. Everything was neat, methodical. It wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. A plan that had started the night of the storm. I was so focused on the ledger that I didn't hear him come in. "What are you doing?" The voice snapped me upright. My uncle stood in the doorway, his face half-shadowed, eyes burning like embers. I froze, the ledger open in my lap. I was looking for answers, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move closer. "Close it." Now I hesitated, then shook my head slowly. "What is this? Why were you paying off the sheriff? Why is the attorney's name here? And what does ELA mean?" For a long moment, he just stared at me, silent and unreadable. Then, finally, he walked to the window, his back to me. "You want to know the truth?" he said softly. "You better be sure you're ready to carry it." I clenched the ledger tighter. "I am." He turned slowly, his face pale and drawn, like a man carrying a weight he couldn't set down. "That ledger, he said quietly. Saved this family. Saved us? I scoffed, holding up the book. From what? From honesty? His expression hardened. From ruin. I stepped closer, refusing to back down. Ruin from what? He hesitated, and for the first time since I'd started digging, I saw something crack in him. Fear. You think you know this land, he said, voice low and tight, but you don't. You don't know what's buried here, what your grandpa started, what Elena saw, what she threatened to expose. My throat went dry. Aunt Elena? He met my gaze, and for a split second, his composure faltered. She was supposed to keep quiet. The room went dead silent. My pulse thundered in my ears as I whispered, What did she see? His shoulders slumped. Go home, he said finally, voice flat and exhausted. Go home and burn that ledger. If you don't, everything you think you know about this family will fall apart. I didn't move, didn't speak, couldn't, because right then, in that suffocating silence, I realized something terrifying. The ledger wasn't just about money, it was about secrets, and secrets don't sleep forever. The next morning, the air was heavy, thick with humidity and secrets. I woke before dawn, the ledger still on my nightstand, its cracked leather cover catching the first pale light. I couldn't stop thinking about my uncle's words from the night before. You don't know what's buried here. I needed to see for myself. The ridge stretched far beyond the house, a mix of wild grass and gnarled sycamores leading down toward the property's edge. I followed the narrow dirt path I used to race along as a kid, back when Grandpa's laughter used to echo behind me. That's when I saw it. At the farthest corner of the land, half hidden behind a tangle of overgrown brush, stood a concrete-capped well. I stopped cold. I didn't remember this being here. As a child, I'd played in these fields for hours, climbing trees and chasing fireflies, but never once had Grandpa mentioned a well. The circular slab was cracked with age, but the iron bolts locking the lid in place looked new. Too new. A chill swept through me, despite the sticky summer heat. I crouched down, brushing away dirt and weeds, tracing my fingers over faint markings etched into the concrete. There were letters carved there, worn nearly smooth by time. E-L-A. My breath caught. There it was again. I reached for my phone, wanting to take a photo, when a twig snapped behind me. You shouldn't be here. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. My uncle stood a few feet away, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his expression unreadable. What is this? I demanded, pointing at the sealed well. He walked slowly toward me, his boots crunching against the dry grass. An old well. Been sealed for years. Nothing you need to worry about. That's not an answer, I said sharply. Why seal it? And why are these letters carved into it? What does E-L-A mean? For the briefest moment, his gaze flicked toward the lid before returning to me. Leave it alone, he said, voice low, measured. I took a step closer, refusing to back down. Was this where Aunt Elena disappeared? That stopped him. His jaw clenched, and his hand twitched. Barely, but enough for me to see it. She didn't disappear, he said after a pause, his tone clipped. She left. People leave. That's all. I shook my head. No, that's not all. Mr. Cole told me about the night of the storm, about the fight, about you driving off like the world was ending. He took a long, steady breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. You think you want the truth, he said finally, but the truth is heavier than you're ready to carry. I stared at him, feeling my pulse in my ears. Try me. For a moment, I thought he might actually answer. But then, without another word, he stepped between me and the well, placing himself firmly in my path. His voice was low, steady, but there was a tremor beneath it I couldn't ignore. If you open that well, he said, you'll never sleep again. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the hum of cicadas in the trees. Finally, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me alone with the sealed concrete, the carved letters, and the gnawing feeling that I was standing on top of something Grandpa never wanted me to find. I stared at the bolts locking the lid, sunlight glinting faintly off the metal. What could be down there? Why seal it? And why did the initials ELA feel less like a clue and more like a warning? I didn't have answers yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. The well wasn't just holding water. It was holding secrets, and secrets don't stay buried forever. The next day, I decided to avoid the house. I needed space to think, to breathe, to piece together the fragments scattered across my mind. The ledger, the storm, the sealed well, and those 3 letters carved into concrete, ELA. Answers weren't going to fall into my lap. I had to start digging, literally. The old tool shed sat behind the barn, its faded red paint peeling under the summer sun. I hadn't been inside it in years. As kids, we used to play hide and seek in there, darting between rusty plows and stacked crates. But now, the place felt different, heavier. When I pushed the door open, the hinges groaned in protest. A wave of hot, stale air rolled out, thick with the scent of oil and damp wood. Dust hung in the beams of sunlight, slicing through the cracks in the roof. I stepped carefully between piles of old tarps, boxes of nails, and jars filled with screws. Every creak of the wooden floor made my chest tighten. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I would know it when I found it. And I did. Beneath a stack of fraying burlap sacks, half buried in sawdust, something caught the light. I crouched down and brushed the dirt away, revealing a small golden hoop, an earring. At first, it meant nothing. Just another forgotten trinket in a forgotten shed. But when I turned it over, my breath caught. There was a tiny engraving on the inner band. E.M.W. Elena Marie Whitmore. I remembered them clearly. Aunt Elena wore these earrings every Sunday without fail, back when we still gathered for big family dinners. I hadn't seen them since the summer she left for the city. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, my heart pounding louder with every passing second. Then I realized something even stranger. The earring wasn't alone. There were faint drag marks in the dust, leading from where I'd found it toward the back of the shed. I followed them slowly, kneeling down until I saw it. A small, perfectly circular indentation in the wooden floor. It was empty now, but it was the exact size of the missing earring's twin. I straightened, the hair on my arms standing on end. Why were Aunt Elena's earrings buried here, under a pile of sacks, in a shed no one ever used anymore? I was still holding the earring when I heard footsteps outside. "Find what you're looking for?" I froze. My uncle stood in the doorway, his frame blocking the sunlight. He leaned casually against the doorframe, but his jaw was tight, and his hands were balled into fists at his sides. I hid the earring in my palm instinctively. "Just cleaning up," I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. His gaze flicked to the corner, where the burlap sacks had been disturbed, then back to me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was so heavy, it felt like the air itself had weight. Then he stepped inside, boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. "You know," he said quietly, "some things get left behind for a reason." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Like this?" I held up the earring. For a split second, his expression faltered. He recovered quickly, forcing a thin smile. "Elena lost those all the time. Probably dropped it before she left. But there was something in his tone. Too smooth. Too rehearsed." "If she lost it," I said slowly, "why was it buried under a tarp in the back of the shed?" His jaw clenched. "You need to stop looking where you're not invited." I stared at him, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Maybe I wouldn't have to if anyone gave me the truth. He took a step closer, and suddenly the small shed felt suffocating. "Be careful," he said softly, but there was no softness in his eyes. "Some holes, once you dig, you can't climb back out." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I slipped the earring into my pocket, brushed past him, and stepped out into the harsh afternoon sunlight. The air outside felt cooler, but my skin burned with the weight of his warning. Because if that earring was here, then maybe Aunt Elena never left at all. I drove straight to my mother's house. The earring in my pocket felt heavier than stone, as if it carried not just gold, but the weight of every lie we'd been told. She opened the door before I even knocked, like she had been standing there, waiting. Her expression shifted the second she saw my face. Relief, fear, and something else I couldn't name. "Come in," she whispered, stepping aside. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, familiar and comforting. But today, even the comfort felt dishonest, like a smile hiding a bruise. I followed her into the living room. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in soft shadows, and the steady tick of the grandfather clock filled the silence between us. She gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing, unable to calm the storm boiling inside me. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the earring, and placed it on the table between us. Her breath caught. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "In the shed," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Under a tarp." Buried, she closed her eyes and sank into the chair, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth. "Mom," I said softly, "I need you to tell me the truth." She didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes glistened with tears she tried and failed to blink away. Finally, she whispered, "I was hoping you'd never find that." My throat tightened. "Why?" "Because it's proof?" She shook her head quickly. "No, because once you start down this road, there's no coming back." I crouched down in front of her, holding her gaze. "I'm already on this road, Mom. Please, just tell me." For a long moment, she said nothing, her chest rising and falling with shaky breaths. Then, almost as if something inside her cracked, she began to speak. "It started after your father died," she said, her voice unsteady but firm. "The debts were worse than you knew. The house, the land, everything. We were drowning. I went to your uncle for help. I clenched my fists, fighting to stay calm. And what did he want in return?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "He said he'd handle it. That he'd take care of the land for us until we could pay him back." I shook my head, my voice rising despite myself. "Handle it how, Mom? By stealing it?" "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I thought it was temporary. I thought he was protecting us." I stared at her, searching her face for some sign she was lying. "And Aunt Elena? What happened to her?" Her shoulders stiffened, and for the first time, she wouldn't meet my eyes. "She knew," I said quietly, realization dawning. "Didn't she?" Mom's silence was louder than any confession. "She saw something that night," I pressed, my voice trembling now. "The storm, the fight, the sudden transfer of land. It all connects, doesn't it?" Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she whispered one sentence, and it made my blood run cold. "Elena was going to go to the sheriff." The room tilted around me. "Go to the sheriff? About what?" She shook her head violently, gripping the arms of the chair. "I don't know." She wouldn't tell me everything, just that she saw something your uncle didn't want anyone to know. "And then she disappeared," I said flatly. Her sob caught in her throat as she looked at me with haunted eyes. "I begged her to stay quiet," she whispered. I thought it would keep her safe." I stepped back, the floor beneath me feeling unsteady, like the whole house was leaning. My chest ached with anger, confusion, and something worse, betrayal. "You trusted him," I said, my voice breaking. "And now we've lost everything." She stood suddenly, reaching for my hands, her tears falling fast. "I trusted him because he was my brother," she said fiercely, "because I thought blood meant safety." I was wrong. I pulled away, turning toward the window, staring at the vast stretch of land outside. The land Grandpa swore would always be ours. "Mom," I said quietly, "you need to tell me what else you know." "Everything," she shook her head, her voice breaking. "I can't." "Some things, even I'm too afraid to say." I looked back at her, tears stinging my own eyes now. "Then I'll find out myself." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence sharp and heavy between us. Then, without warning, the phone on the table rang, slicing through the tension like a blade. Mom answered, her voice trembling. She didn't say a word, just listened. When she hung up, she looked at me, pale as paper. "That was Mr. Cole," she whispered. "He said he found something, near the well." By the time I reached Grandma's house, the sky was already darkening, swollen with heavy gray clouds. The call from Mr. Cole had set something off in me, whatever he found near the well. I needed answers before anyone could hide them again. The old house was silent, except for the groan of the floorboards beneath my feet. I moved through the kitchen, every shadow stretching long and deep, as though the past itself was reaching for me. Mr. Cole wasn't there yet. I had time. I pulled open drawers, cabinets, even the rusted tins stacked beneath the sink, but found nothing. Then, my hand brushed against the old oven handle. A memory surfaced. Grandma pulling out pies in her faded apron, her hands quick and sure, never using mitts because she knew heat by instinct. I crouched and opened the oven door. Empty, but something caught my eye. Behind the oven, in a thin gap against the wall, there was a hidden compartment I'd never noticed before. Dust coated the edges, cobwebs sticking to my fingers as I pried it open. Inside, wrapped in layers of crumbling wax paper, was a letter, or what was left of one. The edges were blackened, as though someone had tried to burn it. I unfolded it carefully, my hands trembling, afraid the paper might fall apart entirely. The handwriting was Grandpa's. I recognized it instantly, the looping W in Whitmore, the deliberate, steady strokes. But the words, they didn't sound like him. They sounded terrified. "If this reaches you, it means the storm has passed. But what we buried that night, we did wrong. Forgive me. Protect the ridge. Protect her. Don't trust him. ELA knows." I froze. The letters again. ELA and her. Who was her? Aunt Elena? Before I could piece it together, the floorboards creaked behind me. I turned sharply, clutching the letter like a weapon. But it was only Mr. Cole, his cap dripping from the rain outside. "You found it," he said softly, glancing at the charred edges. "You knew?" I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded slowly, lowering himself into a chair like the weight of his memories was too much to stand under. "Your grandma told me, right before she passed. Said if anyone went diggin', they'd need to see the letter." "What happened that night?" I asked, stepping closer. "Tell me the truth, Mr. Cole, please." He rubbed his weathered hands together, staring at the floor. "It was worse than just a fight," he said quietly. "Your uncle and your grandpa, they argued about the ridge, about debts, about the deal with the county. But Elena, she saw something she shouldn't have." My chest tightened. "What did she see?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "I think she saw what went into the well." A chill raced down my spine. "What went into the well?" He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. "You ever notice how your uncle sealed it up right after the storm?" he whispered. I nodded slowly. "That's no old well," Mr. Cole said, his voice barely audible. "It was a pit they dug during the drought, back before you were born." But after that night, he poured the concrete himself, paid the county to look the other way. I swallowed hard, gripping the letter so tightly it crumpled in my hands. "Why?" "What's in there?" He hesitated, then said, almost too softly to hear, "Whatever it is, your Aunt Elena wanted the sheriff to find it." I stared at him, my mind spinning, the edges of the letter trembling between my fingers. "And now she's gone," I whispered. Mr. Cole's eyes were glassy when he nodded. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft rumble of thunder rolling in from the ridge. Finally, he leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. "I know someone at the courthouse," he said. "They hid copies of the old survey maps before your uncle's revisions. If we get those maps, we'll know exactly what changed the night Elena disappeared." Before I could respond, headlights swept across the kitchen wall. My uncle's truck. I shoved the burned letter into my pocket, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Mr. Cole whispered, "Don't let him know I was here." Then he slipped out the back door, vanishing into the rain. I turned just as the front door opened. My uncle stepped inside, dripping from the storm, his expression unreadable, but his eyes landed on the open oven. And for the first time, I saw him falter. The rain didn't stop that night. It came down in sheets, drumming against Grandma's old windows until the glass trembled in their frames. My uncle sat across from me at the kitchen table, dripping from the storm, his wet boots leaving muddy prints on the faded linoleum. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at me, at my hands, at the oven door I'd left open. "You're digging too deep," he said finally, his voice low, quiet, almost calm. "You won't like what you find." I tried to keep my breathing steady. Maybe I already don't. For a moment, his jaw tightened, but then he stood, grabbed a towel from the counter, and dried his hands like we were discussing dinner plans instead of decades of lies. "I went into town this morning," I said carefully, testing him. "Courthouse archives. Records office. Funny thing, though, they couldn't find a single document about Grandpa's land transfers." He froze. Just for a second, but I saw it. "You shouldn't be talking to people," he said sharply. "They'll start asking you questions back." I leaned forward. Why would they? Unless there's something worth hiding, his eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the old landline rang, its sharp chime cutting through the tension like a blade. I answered on instinct. "Mrs. Whitmore?" A raspy voice on the other end. "This is Evelyn from the county records office. I shouldn't be calling, but..." She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful. People around here don't forget what happened the night of the storm." My grip on the receiver tightened. "What happened?" Another pause, heavier this time. "Ask about the Whitmore Trust. That's where it started. And find the librarian." Then the line went dead. I turned slowly to face my uncle, but he was already watching me closely, his arms crossed over his chest. "Who was that?" he asked. I lied. "Wrong number." He didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his gaze lingered a little too long, the way his shoulders stayed tense even as he walked out of the kitchen without another word. The next morning, I drove into town before the sun came up. The courthouse was locked, the records office closed, but the library doors were open. I found the old librarian, Mrs. Grafton, sitting behind the desk, a mug of lukewarm coffee in her hand. When I introduced myself, she smiled faintly, but there was something cautious in her eyes. "Ah," she said softly. "A Whitmore." I nodded. "I need to know what happened here. 25 years ago. The storm." Her smile faded. She set down her mug, folding her thin hands over each other. "I remember that night," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "People talk about the weather, the lightning, but no one talks about what came after. They're too scared." I leaned in, my heart pounding. "Scared of what?" Her gaze shifted toward the dusty shelves, as though checking for listening ears. "Your Aunt Elena came here the day before she disappeared," she said finally. "She was terrified. Said she'd found proof the land deal wasn't legal. She wanted copies of the original surveys, the ones before your uncle's revisions." My throat tightened. "Did she get them?" The librarian nodded slowly. "I made her copies myself. She left here clutching them like her life depended on it." I swallowed hard. And the next night, she was gone. Mrs. Grafton's eyes softened with something like pity. "That land, your family's land, It carries more than history, child. It carries debts. And debts get paid one way or another. Before I could ask what she meant, she reached under the counter and pulled out a worn envelope, sealed with brittle tape. "I've been holding on to this," she said, sliding it across the desk. "Elena gave it to me the day she vanished, told me to keep it safe, said someone might come looking for it, one day." I stared at the envelope, my hand hovering above it. "What's inside?" She shook her head. "I never looked." Didn't want to know, I slipped the envelope into my bag and left without another word, the librarian's warning echoing in my head. Back at the house, I locked my door and tore the tape open. Inside were black and white photos, grainy but clear enough to see faces. My uncle, the sheriff, the county registrar, and Elena, standing beside the sealed well. Her expression was tense, her shoulders rigid, like she knew she wasn't supposed to be there. On the back of one photo, written in Elena's handwriting, were 4 chilling words. "He knows." "Bury it." My stomach dropped. I stared at the photos, my pulse pounding in my ears, and finally understood what the librarian meant. This wasn't about boundaries. It wasn't about deeds or signatures. This was about something buried deep, something my uncle would do anything to keep hidden, and Aunt Elena had been the only one who tried to dig it up. The invitation came from my cousin Laura. "Just a simple family dinner," she said. But nothing about this family was simple anymore. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to avoid the glares, the unspoken questions, the performance of normalcy. But the photos from Elena's envelope were still burning a hole in my pocket, and I needed to see their faces when I mentioned them. The house smelled like rosemary and roasted meat when I arrived, the kind of warm, inviting scent meant to trick you into feeling safe. I stepped inside and felt immediately suffocated. My uncle sat at the head of the table, carving a roast with deliberate precision. My mother sat 2 seats down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Laura was at the far end, eyes darting between us like she already sensed the storm brewing. I took my seat across from my uncle. The silence was sharp enough to cut skin. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You've been busy," he said flatly, passing me the basket of bread. I didn't take it. "I've been finding answers." His knife paused mid-slice, just for a second, before continuing. "Be careful with your answers," he said softly. "Some can't be unsaid." The air was thick with tension. Even the clinking of cutlery sounded too loud, too deliberate. Then Laura broke the silence. "So," she said brightly, forcing a smile, "how's everyone's week been?" No one answered. Her fake cheer dissolved like sugar in hot tea. I leaned back, folding my arms. "Did Elena come to one of these dinners before she disappeared?" I asked suddenly, keeping my gaze locked on my uncle. The knife froze this time. He didn't look up, but his knuckles whitened around the handle. "That was a long time ago," he said evenly. "Best leave the past where it belongs." "Funny," I said, my voice steady but sharp, "because the past keeps showing up in the shed, the well, and Grandma's burned letters." Mom inhaled sharply beside me, but my uncle just set the knife down slowly and finally looked at me. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Careful," he said softly. "People who dig too deep tend to get buried." For a moment, the table was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Then Laura shifted, brushing her napkin into her lap. As she leaned down, her hand brushed mine under the table, pressing something small and folded into my palm. I glanced at her, but she avoided my gaze completely, her expression carefully blank. I palmed the note without drawing attention and unfolded it in my lap. 2 words, hastily scribbled in messy ink. "Don't stay." My chest tightened, and I slipped the note into my pocket, heart pounding against my ribs. "Everything okay?" my uncle asked, his tone too casual, too smooth. I forced a thin smile. "Perfect," I said. Laura's fork clattered onto her plate, loud in the tense silence. "Excuse me," she muttered and hurried out of the room. My uncle watched her leave, his jaw tightening just slightly before he turned back to me. "Finish your dinner," he said quietly, "and then we'll talk." It wasn't a suggestion. I pushed the food around my plate without eating, my mind spinning as I tried to decode Laura's warning. Why tell me not to stay? What did she know? And why was she too scared to say it out loud? I caught my mother's eye across the table. Her lips trembled slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but when my uncle looked her way, she dropped her gaze immediately. That's when I knew. Everyone in this room was keeping secrets, and I was sitting in the middle of them. The night air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and rain-soaked leaves. After dinner, my uncle asked me to step out for some air. It wasn't a request. The porch creaked beneath our weight as we stood there in silence. Somewhere in the distance, frogs croaked by the creek, and the cicadas hummed like they were keeping time for something inevitable. The storm clouds had passed, but the tension hadn't. My uncle leaned against the railing, his back to me, the orange glow of his cigarette burning like a tiny ember in the darkness. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the damp night air. "You've been busy," he said finally, his voice low, steady, too calm. "I've been learning," I replied. "About the land. About the well. About Elena." The silence stretched between us like a rope pulled taut. He flicked the ash into the grass before turning to face me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, held something cold beneath the surface. "I'm gonna make this simple," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an envelope, thick, heavy. He extended it toward me. "A gesture of goodwill," he said. I didn't move. "What's in it?" He smiled faintly, that controlled, deliberate smile he always wore when lying. "A settlement," he said softly. "Consider it an apology. Take it, and we put this behind us." I stared at the envelope, but didn't reach for it. "And if I don't?" His smile faded. The porch light buzzed faintly overhead, casting his shadow long and sharp across the wooden planks. "Then you'll keep digging," he said quietly, "and you'll find things you can't unsee." I folded my arms. What happened to Elena? For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, quickly smothered. "She left," he said firmly, almost rehearsed. I shook my head slowly. Then why did I find her earring in the shed? Why is her name carved into the well? Why did Grandpa's burned letter warn us not to trust you? His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low and even. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do," I snapped. "I know there was a fight that night. I know she was going to the sheriff. I know something happened during the storm, something you've been hiding for 25 years. He stepped closer, the wooden boards groaning under his boots. "You think you want the truth," he said softly, almost gently, "but the truth will eat you alive." I met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Then let it." For the first time all evening, his mask slipped, his face hardened, and I caught the faintest tremor in his voice when he spoke again. "You opened that well," he said, "and this family will never recover." I swallowed hard, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Maybe we're not supposed to recover," I said quietly. "Maybe we're supposed to know." He stared at me for a long moment, the tension stretching so thin it felt like the whole porch might splinter beneath us. Then, slowly, deliberately, he placed the envelope on the railing between us. "You'll regret it if you don't take this," he murmured. I looked down at the envelope, then back at him, shaking my head. "I'll regret it if I do." His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stubbed out his cigarette, slipped his hands into his pockets, and walked back into the house without another word. I stood there alone, listening to the creak of the floorboards fade away, the envelope untouched. When I finally picked it up, I didn't open it. I didn't need to, because I already knew it wasn't a gift. It was a muzzle, and I wasn't ready to be silenced. The next morning, I drove out to the farthest edge of the property, where the fields gave way to wild grass and a single ancient sycamore rose like a sentinel against the pale sky. Mr. Cole was already there, leaning against his old truck, his cap pulled low over his eyes. When he saw me, he waved me over, his face pale and lined with shadows I hadn't noticed before. "You said you found something," I called out as I approached. He nodded and motioned to the ground beneath the tree. "There," he said quietly. "Something was buried here long before the well was sealed." I stared at the patch of earth he'd already disturbed, a dark circle where the soil looked richer, wetter than the land around it. My chest tightened. "Buried what?" "Only one way to find out," he murmured. He handed me a spade, and together we dug. The dirt was damp and heavy, clinging to our hands and boots. With each shovelful, my heartbeat quickened, my breath coming faster, as though the ground itself was holding its secrets tight. Finally, the blade of my spade scraped against something solid. I knelt, brushing away the soil with trembling fingers, until a small, rusted object emerged. A pocket watch. The engraved initials on the back were unmistakable. H. W. Harold Whitmore. My grandfather. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "This was his," I whispered. Mr. Cole nodded slowly, his expression grim. "I haven't seen that watch since the week before the storm." I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it like an anchor in my chest. But as I brushed away more dirt, my fingertips caught on something else. A scrap of faded fabric, stiff and brittle with age, buried just beneath the watch. It was pale blue, patterned with tiny white flowers. I knew it instantly. Aunt Elena's blouse. The air around us shifted, thick and suffocating. I looked up at Mr. Cole, my voice shaking. "Why would this be here? Why bury her things?" He glanced toward the ridge, where the sealed well stood, hidden beyond the trees, his jaw tightening. "I don't know," he said, but his tone betrayed him. He knew something, he just wasn't saying. I pulled the fabric free, holding it in my hands, the weight of memory pressing down. Sunday dinners. Elena's laugh echoing through the kitchen, the way she used to brush my hair behind my ear when I was little. All of it swallowed by silence. I stood slowly, my knees weak, the pocket watch and fabric trembling in my hands. "She never left, did she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Cole's silence was an answer in itself. Before I could press him further, the sound of crunching gravel cut through the stillness. I turned to see my uncle's truck approaching, the tires spitting up dirt as he stopped a few feet away. He stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his face unreadable. His eyes swept over the disturbed ground, the objects in my hands, and finally settled on Mr. Cole. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. "Helping," Mr. Cole replied evenly, though his hands were trembling slightly at his sides. My uncle's gaze shifted to me, cold and deliberate. "You're trespassing," he said. "This is our land," I shot back. He took a slow step closer, his shadow stretching long under the sycamore's branches. "Not if you keep digging where you don't belong." I tightened my grip on the pocket watch. "I found this," I said, holding it up. "Explain why Grandpa's watch and Elena's blouse were buried here." For a long moment, he said nothing, his jaw working as if chewing words he couldn't spit out. Finally, he glanced toward the ridge, then back at me, his voice barely audible. "Go home," he said, his tone flat, final. "Before you uncover something you can't put back." He turned and walked back to his truck without another word, leaving the engine idling loud and angry in the silence. I stared after him, my pulse racing, the earth beneath me suddenly feeling unsteady, fragile. Because for the first time, I wasn't just chasing shadows and suspicions. I was holding proof, and I was starting to believe the truth about Elena was buried deeper than any of us wanted to admit. I couldn't shake the image of the pocket watch and Elena's blouse buried beneath the sycamore. It haunted me all night, tangled in my dreams like whispers I couldn't fully hear. But when morning came, one thought echoed louder than the rest. Grandma knew. She had hidden the burned letter in the oven wall. She had tucked away the map, and if anyone had left more clues, it would be her. I drove back to her house, the air heavy with mist rolling off the fields. The old floorboards groaned beneath my weight as I stepped into the kitchen where so many secrets had already been unearthed. My eyes landed on her old wooden bread box sitting on the counter. It hadn't been touched in years, dust dulling its once polished surface. Something inside me stirred, a quiet certainty. I reached for it. The hinges protested as I lifted the lid, and there, beneath a stack of brittle recipe cards, lay a small, unlabeled cassette tape wrapped in faded floral cloth. My breath caught. I unwrapped it carefully and turned it over in my hand. Faintly etched on one corner, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, were 3 letters. E-L-A. The same letters. Again. Over and over, they were everywhere. I carried the tape to the old cassette player in the living room and slid it in. The machine whirred to life, crackling faintly through the static. Then I heard it. Grandpa's voice. Rough, strained, and unlike I'd ever heard it before. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone low and urgent. "You don't fix debts by burying the truth." Another voice cut in sharply. My uncle. "You think I wanted this? You think I had a choice? You should have told me what was in the ridge before you signed it over." My chest tightened, leaning closer as the static buzzed between their words. Grandpa again. "Elena saw everything. If she talks, we'll lose everything. Land, house, reputation, everything your father built." Then came my uncle's voice, shaking but furious. "Then she can't talk." The words hit me like a slap. I froze, staring at the player, willing myself to have misheard. But Grandpa's response came, low and cold, sending a chill down my spine. "Do what you have to do. Just keep it quiet," Static hissed. The tape clicked. Silence. I sat frozen on the couch, staring at the player like it might explain itself. My throat was dry, my palms damp. I replayed the tape, desperate to hear something different the second time, but the words didn't change. They couldn't. Elena saw something in the ridge, something that made her a threat. And Grandpa had given the order. I pressed my fist into my eyes, trying to make sense of it, when a floorboard creaked behind me. I turned sharply. My uncle stood in the doorway. "You found it," he said softly, his voice flat, almost resigned. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady. "What happened to her?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He just stared at the player, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists. "You weren't supposed to hear that," he said finally, his tone low, dangerous. I rose to my feet, trembling but unyielding. "Tell me, Uncle. Tell me what's in the ridge. Tell me what's under that well." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Nothing good," he said. "And if you're smart, you'll stop looking." Before I could respond, he reached past me, ejected the tape, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Some doors," he murmured, his eyes dark and unreadable, should never be opened. Then he walked out, leaving me in the silence, his words carved deep into my bones. But it was too late for warnings, because for the first time, I knew. The sealed well wasn't just a metaphor, and Elena hadn't left this land. She was still here. Somewhere. The house was silent when I returned that night. But it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that hums, heavy and alive, like the air before a storm. I found my uncle sitting on the porch, the cassette tape in his hand, unspooled ribbon dangling loosely between his fingers. He didn't look at me when I stepped outside. "You were supposed to leave this alone," he said quietly. I sank into the chair across from him, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. "I couldn't," I whispered. "Not after what I found." Not after what Elna knew. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly, as if gathering the weight of decades into one fragile breath. When he spoke, his voice was low, hoarse. "Elena thought she could save us," he said. "She thought if she told the sheriff, the county would protect her. But she didn't understand." He trailed off, staring into the darkness beyond the porch. Understand what? I pressed. That the county wasn't on our side, he said finally, his voice trembling with anger. Not at me, but at something older, deeper. The land was worth too much. There were deals already made. People with power. They weren't going to let one frightened woman ruin it. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. So you silenced her? His head snapped toward me, his face pale beneath the porch light. I didn't touch her, he said sharply, and for the first time, I believed him. But then his voice softened into something more fragile, more broken. I tried to protect her, he whispered. I begged her to leave, to disappear, just until the deal was done. But she wouldn't. She said Grandpa's plan was wrong, said she'd rather burn the whole place down than be part of it. My chest tightened. And then the storm came. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the ridge, where the sealed well waited in silence. That night, he said, his voice so low I had to lean forward to hear him. She ran out there during the worst of it, said she had proof, said she'd show the sheriff everything, but she never made it. The ridge flooded. Mudslides buried half the field. He rubbed his temples, the cigarette between his fingers trembling faintly. By the time I got to the well, she was gone. I stared at him, my voice barely more than a whisper. Gone where? His silence was the only answer. I thought of Elena's blouse buried beneath the sycamore, the carved initials on the well, the burned letter begging us to protect the ridge. Every fragment of truth I'd uncovered pointed to one possibility I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. She's still here, I whispered finally, the words trembling in the night air. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. His silence was agreement enough. I sat there for a long time, listening to the cicadas drone, the night stretching endlessly between us. Neither of us spoke again. There were no words left, not ones that could change what had been done. When dawn finally broke, pale light spilled across the fields, painting the ridge in muted gold. I stood at the porch railing, staring at the sealed well in the distance, knowing there were things beneath it we might never unearth. And maybe we weren't meant to. I thought of what I'd found, the ledger, the burned letter, the photos, the tape. Each one had been a key. Each one had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. This land was ours by blood, but that blood was a debt I hadn't known I was carrying. And now, every step I took on it felt heavier than before. I turned to my uncle, who sat slumped in his chair, shoulders bowed beneath years of silence. What happens now? I asked softly. He didn't answer for a long time. Then, finally, he said, You live with it. Like I have, I looked back at the ridge, where the well stood hidden under layers of concrete and secrecy. My fingers clenched at my sides, aching with the weight of everything we'd uncovered, and everything we still hadn't. Because sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it binds you tighter than any lie ever could. And some secrets stay buried because the living can't afford to dig them up. If you've stayed with me until the end, maybe your heart has felt something too. Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe if you'd like to continue sharing these stories with me.